Is anybody's phobia that? So I remember after seeing Jaws, and it would have been early 80s for me, and being afraid of being in my aunt's swimming pool in San Antonio. It was like completely irrational, but still, it was there. Well, good morning. Great to see you. Welcome to church this morning. We are we're starting the year with a series about a religious leader from a nation that considered itself uniquely blessed by God, a nation that had an on-again, off-again enemy in the Middle East, a terrorist state by all accounts, aggressively rivalistic religion in this enemy nation, but an enemy that was at this particular moment in history in decline, and that allowed our heroes nation to prosper and to expound its boundaries. But now God had called our protagonist to travel to the capital city of the enemy state and preach to them so that they might repent and embrace God and be blessed themselves, right? And so instead of that, right, the hero, being a patriot as he was, he jumped on the first drone heading the other way, right? Let's not stretch the analogy too far. But the truth is, the Old Covenant book of Jonah has a lot to talk to us about our contemporary situations, as well, of course, being a book, even though it's a short book, just jam-packed with transformational truths for any age. Some of them we might not want to hear. I think all of them, though, we're in desperate need of. So, quick review of the book of Jonah. Last week we saw in the first few verses that Jonah was a prophet from Israel. God sent him to Nineveh, which was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire, with a message of warning and repentance. And what Jonah does, of course, is he runs away. We looked at the runaway prophet last week. He refuses to go. He goes, in fact, in the opposite direction. Nineveh, we said, is in modern-day Iraq, and Jonah boards a ship for Tarshish, which is in Spain. I don't know if you know your map, but Iraq and Spain are in different directions from where he was in Israel. So he's on the run. But why? Because Jonah has in his heart two deep currents. And in fact, I hesitate to even call them feelings because they're so much stronger than the word feelings denotes. But the two reasons he runs are the current of fear and the current of anger. He's got a lot of fear. He's got a lot of anger. He's afraid to go to Nineveh because why put himself in the very middle of his enemies? But he's also filled with hate towards them, see. So on the one hand, if they reject his message, they may kill him. Or worse, actually, the Assyrians really made a name for torture. There's some stuff in history of what they did. We may get to that later. That's the fear part. But if they receive his message, see, and then God could forgive them and they could be back on top. And so who wants that for your enemy? So fear and anger tied up in the heart of Jonah, and that's appropriate because fear and anger really do go together. The reality is anger is always a secondary emotion. I don't know if you know this. Anger is not a primary emotion. It is always got something else lurking behind it. So for instance, frustration can lead to anger, right? Austin traffic, anybody? Where's that coming? It's frustration. You can't get to where you want to get to. Shame and embarrassment can lead to anger. Grief can lead to anger. We live in a society, for instance, that tells men that it's more acceptable to express anger than to express sadness. By the way, that's what's behind almost all divorce acrimony. You staunch the wounds of pain by saving anger. Society says, don't let us see you be sad, but oh, you're angry. Okay, we get that. But one of the biggest causes of anger is fear. Now, if you study Hebrew literary context, it will show you that the passage we're going to look at today is clearly meant to be about fear. The chapter opens, closes, and centers on the mention of fear. And so as I read it for you in a moment, watch for the idea of fear throughout it. You'll notice in verse 5, the storm comes up and it says they were afraid. In verse 10 through 11, it says the storm gets higher and they're terrified. And then finally you get down to the very end, and the storm gets calm in verse 16, and it says they're filled with great fear. So clearly there's something we're to learn about the concept of fear from this chapter. And I don't know about you, but I could use some help with the dealing with fear. So let's read the text, and then we'll break it down. So God called Jonah. Jonah Ubered the first ship going the other way and ran off. And so part of this we read last week, but we need to overlap a little bit. So Jonah chapter 1, let's look at verses 4 through 17. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm rose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, that last verse is really a preview of the next chapter. It really belongs in the next chapter, and we'll look at that next week. But for today, let's look at what this has to tell us about the nature of fear. And we're going to use 3 things to get us there. We're going to look at the storm, we're going to look at the sailors, and we're going to look at the substitute. So the stormy sea shows us who we are. The religious sailors show us the wrong way to go about trying to fix it, and the willing substitute shows us the right thing to do about it. So first of all, the stormy sea, and I'm going to be brief on this point, but I think it's very interesting. It's verse 5. All the sailors were afraid, and each what? Cried out to his own God. Now, stereotypically, what do we know about sailors in general? Anybody here in the Navy, been a Navy man? Yeah, we got a couple Navy guys. What do we know about sailors? When we say, "Man, he's acting like a sailor on shore leave," is that code for he went to church? It is not, right? No, you don't think of these as being really religious people, right? Not terribly devout. But then a storm comes up, and what do we see? Each one is crying out. They're praying. See? And so the first thing we learn here, which is important, is storms tend to reveal who we really are. In spite of what you say to people, and in spite of what you say to yourself. Storms, sufferings, troubles, bankruptcies, death. Storms reveal to us that deep in our hearts, we are all of us God knowers and God needers. Okay? No matter what you tell yourself, no matter what you say to others, deep down inside, you know there is a God, you know you need him, and it's storms that bring that out. There's kind of a haunting piece for me in Mark Twain. He wrote autobiography somewhere towards the end of his life when one of his, and I couldn't find it quickly, but it was either his wife or it was his daughter was ill, very, very ill, and he cared deeply about them. And in his distress, he found himself praying. And here's what he said. He said, I prayed like a coward. I prayed like a dog." Now, the reason that Mark Twain was so distressed by this was because he was a skeptic. Mark Twain very famously had very strong beliefs against Christianity, well worked out, doubts about God. But in the storm, what? He cried out. See, he couldn't help it. It was like it was an involuntary muscle reflex or something. And so there was just this reflex in him that naturally turned toward God. Now, skeptics are constantly saying, so what? People get into trouble, they get into danger, and they pray. That doesn't prove there's a God. And that's not what I'm saying, actually. Listen, this involuntary reflex that people find in their hearts in times of darkness and troubles and storms, there's this almost involuntary need to pray and cry out, is not evidence to skeptics for the existence of God. I think it's actually evidence from God against the existence of skeptics. In Romans 1, Paul lays out this argument that nobody is a real skeptic. You may tell yourself, you may blog about your doubts in Religion 101, but deep down in every heart, the nature of the heart reveals there's a God. This is Paul's argument in the beginning of Romans. And that gets proven in times of storms, because in times of storms, you see that you are a dependent, fragile, helpless being who really isn't in control of your life. C.S. Lewis says the human heart is like a cellar, and if you really want to know what's lurking down there, you have to surprise it. Okay? Now, we don't have basements in Texas, right? We're not basement people, but we've watched enough TV. Right, you've seen enough movies that we get the general idea of the metaphor. So listen to what he says. If there are rats in the cellar, you are most likely to see them if you go in very suddenly. But the suddenness does not create the rats. It only prevents them from hiding. In the same way, the suddenness of the provocation does not make me an ill-tempered man. It only shows me what an ill-tempered man I am. The rats are always there in the cellar. But if you go in shouting and noisily, they will have taken cover before you switch on the light. See, basically what he's saying is that a pop quiz is the best indicator of what you really know. And the storm is the pop quiz of your soul. So, in other words, here's how you know what your heart really is. Here's how you know who you really are. Not when you can deliberately act in a way that you want to think of yourself or you want other people to think of, but when your instincts, when your reflexes are engaged. Just when you're like, right? In a storm, that brings out who you really are, and in a storm, you know there's a God. So that's the real you. And the reality is, there are some of you here in church, and when I see you come to church, my initial reaction is, oh goodness, I hope everything's okay. Because the pattern tends to be that when storms come up in your life, you're here at church. And you're here every week, and you're listening, you're taking, and then things settle down, and the sun comes out, and you kind of get distracted, and we don't see you for a while. That's kind of the pattern of our age. And I'm not meaning to insult anybody. This is from love. Listen, I want you to find shelter here in the storm, absolutely. It's just if you made it your lifestyle. The storms, while they would still appear, let's be clear about that, they would generally seem a bit smaller. But that's what storms do. They reveal to us that we are dependent people who need God. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's what the storms show us. But what do we do about it? Right way, wrong way. Wrong way, right way. We'll do it that order. So first of all, or secondly, let's look at the religious sailors. We've said most people get religious when the storms come, right? There are no atheists in foxholes, as they say. You remember after 9/11, when everybody started going to church? I don't know if you remember this. Everybody was in church. The president was on TV telling us, go to our houses of worship, and we did. I had a theory that maybe Osama bin Laden was a pastor. Maybe it was because it was good for business. It was just the church was packed every Sunday for a while. Get religious, pray, and we did. But it didn't last, did it? No, it didn't. And in fact, church attendance has actually been in steady decline in America ever since 9/11. And I think this text is telling us why. I think it's showing us that just getting religious in response to fear isn't going to work. So if you look at this text, it shows us that these sailors are being pushed into actually kind of a process of religious development during their fear of the storm. So the first stage, verses 5 through 10, we kind of see them progress from being just sort of normal idolaters and casual polytheists to becoming really devout polytheists. And they're calling out to their own gods, right? They're crying out. But that's not enough. And then they actually move over in the second half to cry out to Yahweh. They cry out to the true God in verse 6. By the way, it's almost comical. One commentator I read called Jonah the great parody story of the Bible. But the story says that the captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." You'll notice the text doesn't put a capital G on that. It leaves it a lowercase g in the God. You see what's happening? Their gods aren't working, right? But in the spirit of, quite literally, any port in a storm, they come to him and say, "Listen, okay, you got a God? Our gods aren't working. Let us have your God." Because, you see, they would have expected his God to be there. Everybody had their gods. They were statues. They were images. And you brought your gods with you on trips. Just like my daughter to this day still takes her teddy bear with her when we go on vacations or trips. The whole point of this part of the narration is that the terror comes up and they begin to get religious, and it doesn't help them. See, at first they're polytheists, multiple gods. Then they get orthodox. It still doesn't help them. They're terrified, and they get more and more terrified as it goes on. Why? Why doesn't the religion work? Let's take a look at it in two stages. The first stage is this: less religious people rely on material things. Who rely on material things are absolutely defenseless against fear. And I say material things because, understand, these sailors had material gods. We understand what I mean when I say polytheism. Probably so. Let me just real quick Greek lesson. 3 words. Theos means God. And poly means many, and monos means one, right? And so the Jews were monotheistic. They believed in one transcendent, overarching God of the universe. Today, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are the 3 great monotheistic religions of our day. But most ancient peoples believed in many gods, polytheism. Another way to look at it is they didn't see one God that created everything, but rather they saw everything created as God. And so the sea had a God, and trade had a God, and farming had a God, and sexuality had a God, and the sun was a God, and on and on and on it goes. And all these things could be worshipped, and so you had to decide which one you were going to worship, right? You couldn't do them all. Right? It's like sports teams. You got to pick a jersey, right? And so some people worship the business god or the trade god, because that's what they did. And some people worship the sexuality god. And some people worship their family's god or their city's god or their nation's gods. In other words, you would choose the entity that most affects you personally, and you would make that material thing your God. You would make it your hope. You would make it the thing that really is at the center of your life. And so you worship it. Okay. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that that's not really too far from what Austin is like. Of course, in Austin, most people are very secular, and we'd like to think that we've evolved, beyond those primitive times. But not really. Really, we've just come full circle, because most people in Austin don't believe in an overarching, universal God. They don't go to synagogue or church or that sort of thing. And yet every human being has to look to something for their meaning in life. Every human being has to have something that they invest in. We talk about this all the time at Southwest Family. But in other words, when a person says, even when they say, "I'm not religious," okay, the fact is that you're finding some material thing, whether it's your career or romance or your family or your children or your money or your art or whatever it is, you're saying that's the thing that really gives my life meaning. And so that, therefore, in a sense, is my God. So one of the first things this narrative tells these sailors is that the infinite thing that you turn to, okay, besides God or more than God, is shown to be inferior in a storm. You know why? Because they're in the boat with you. And if your God is in the boat with you, they're going to sink right along beside you. In fact, if you cling to a God carved of stone in a stormy sea, what's going to happen? You're just going to sink to the bottom even faster. See, a very tragic example of that from the news this week. It was reported that a Hollywood producer about my own age committed suicide this week. And he had produced a hit show about a decade ago called Ugly Betty. My wife really liked that show. It won some Emmys and things. And so one of the obituaries mentioned an interview they'd done with him in 2008 at the pinnacle of his success. And it says this: "My first year doing this, people would constantly ask me, 'Aren't you happy? You must be thrilled. You've got a hit show. You must be having the time of your life.' Well, no, I'm not. It's all consuming. I was so exhausted by the time I got home on Friday night, I was just paralyzed. I didn't want to go out. I didn't want to socialize, and I had so much work to do. That was it. That was my life." See, even when he got what he wanted, this is the Hollywood Reporter. This isn't some preacher thing. Even when he got what he wanted, when he climbed the mountain, he got the awards, right? It wasn't enough. It wasn't filling the emptiness. It wasn't calming the storms. And then the article went on to say that since then, he'd struggled to follow up his success with Ugly Betty. He had multiple shows in the development, but nothing ever got on the air. It's very sad. See, the mountaintop didn't lift him out of the storm. And then the valley eventually sunk him. A storm is a storm. Nobody just walks out of storms. Nobody just sails through storms. Storms are terrible. But if the thing that you've centered your life on, if the real thing that makes you feel good about yourself is not greater than the storm, it's going to be of no help. Why? Because it's just going to sink with you. See? In other words, any finite thing is susceptible to storms, just like you are. Circumstances can take them away. Disease and enemies and economic downturns, they can take these things away. They're in the boat with you. Right? You cry out to your gods, but how can they help you? They're in the boat with you. They're going to sink with you. So that's the less religious people. Right? People who live for material things, they're defenseless against fears and storms. So surely somebody says, "Okay, Anthony, already ahead of you. What you really want us then to do is come to, your church, not live for career and sex and money and things like that. Just come to church, obey the 10 Commandments, start to say no to a whole lot of things that we used to say yes to, become ethical, become Christian, read the Bible, pray, go to Bible studies, go to connect groups, all that sort of thing, and then I'll be safe, right? Because if I do all that, then I know that God will protect me. I won't live for material things. I'll live for God." But be careful. See? Of course, that's part of the answer. And yet, here's what I want you to see. Religious people can cling to spirituality in a way that will not protect against fear. Almost always, when people first say, "I'm not going to live for material things, I'm going to live for God," they really don't know what that means. And what you see, interesting here, is when these guys begin to call out on Yahweh. That's what it says in verse 14 when it tells us they weren't calling on their idols anymore, but it says they went to call on, quote, the Lord. Whenever you see the Lord in the Old Testament in all caps, that is code for Yahweh, the God of Israel, right? But here's the thing. Even though they've got the right deity now, they're just as scared. Why? Because they're bargaining with God just like they did with their idols. What do they say? They say, "Look, your prophet says we're supposed to throw them in. Okay, we want to obey the prophet, but we're scared of you now. See, we don't want you to kill us. We want to obey, and your prophet says to throw them in. But wait a minute, isn't murder? Isn't that murder? Isn't that sin? We don't want to disobey. What are we going to do?" So they're scared. They're not opening their hearts to their loving Father based on grace. They've entered into a fear-based, bargaining relationship with God. And so what I'm trying to show you here, and I think what the narrative is trying to show you, something that's very, very important. If you approach fear with just a religious base, just getting religious in general, just saying, "I'm coming to church now, I'm going to start praying, I'm going to start doing the things," See, a lot of people say, I haven't been coming to church, I haven't had much God in my life, and now these terrible things have happened to me, and so I feel vulnerable, I feel unsafe. I'm going to go to God, I'm going to start praying, and then I'll feel safe. I'm going to start praying, and I'll know God is with me, and I'm being a good person. That is not going to save you from fear. See, there's basically three kinds of people in the world. There are irreligious people, there are religious people, and then there are Christians. And Christians are people who know that they are saved by grace. They're people who believe the gospel in spite of who they are, in spite of what they've done, in spite of the fact that they deserve nothing and can earn nothing, but by the sheer grace of God, because of what Jesus Christ has done for them, they confess, I am accepted, and therefore I live a life of gratitude. It's a grace-based, gratitude-based religion, but most people do not understand the difference between religion and Christianity. They think Christianity is just being religious and just being moral. And so what they do is they say, I'm going to read the Bible, I'm going to pray, I'm going to be a good person, I'm going to give my life to Christ, I'm going to try to do everything He says, I'm going to try to live for Him. But what they really mean is I'm going to make God protect me. I'm going to be so good that He'll have to protect me now. I mean, look at all the things I've done. God owes me clear sailing. What you're doing is with your goodness, you're trying to control Him. Okay? So three kind of people. And by the way, by far the religious people are the worst. I'm sorry. They just are. They're the meanest. Okay? Religion killed Jesus. And they're the most scared. In fact, I think it's their fear that leads to their meanness. But why so much fear? See, if you start coming to church after some great disaster and you feel better at first, but you really don't understand the difference between grace and religion, but between living and receiving freely from God and striking a bargain from God, a bargain with God, you're going to keep living in fear. For instance, did you know if you're in that state, one of the worst things you can do is listen to a sermon? Does that seem strange to be coming from a pastor? But here's the thing. Every week, the sermon is going to tell you something else that you need to do to be a good person, right? So this week, it's be generous with your money, and you say to yourself, oh my gosh, you know what? Yeah, I really have been spending too much on myself. Next week, it's care for the poor. Week after that, it's forgive your enemies. Every week, oh my gosh, you're just getting worse and worse. How am I ever going to be able to do all this? Right? If God is going to bless me, I have to be good. And every week I see how much more good there is to be. And so the fact of the matter is, all kinds of people have approached the true God. They're into orthodoxy like these guys. They're into ethics. They're saying, just tell us the rules. Hey, can we kill the prophet or can't we? What are the rules? We'll do anything just as long as it keeps us from drowning, so give us the rules. Frankly, that is religion for an awful lot of people. Nice people, good people, sincere people, people in the church, probably people in this church. But you don't see the truth through it. Well, what we see here is religion is not the way to deal with fear. The reality is it just opens you up to more fear. It doesn't help. Some of the most fearful people I know have been in the church their whole lives. So what are we going to do? Well, the stormy sea shows us who we really are, right? Weak, dependent, needy, non-self-sufficient creatures. Secondly, the sailors show us, that's a tongue twister. Sailors show us that religion in general doesn't help with the fear. Right? So what will? Third and final point, we have to see the willing substitute. Verse 12, it says, where Jonah says, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Now, I'm going to tell you, I've been reading a bunch of commentaries on Jonah, and it's kind of interesting. These are people that know their stuff. They know Hebrew, they know the ancient text, they know the literary structure, they know all this stuff. And it's interesting, none of them can agree on this question. Why is Jonah doing this? Pick me up, throw me in the sea. Some of them say, okay, Jonah is finally coming to his senses. This is a good thing. He sees he's disobeyed God. So what he's saying is, I have sinned against God. I deserve death. I'm willing to take my my licks, throw me out. So he's clearly obeying God. He's finally submitting to God. Other commentators believe what he's really saying is, you know what? I'd rather die than go to those dirty Ninevites. I'd rather die than to obey God. So go ahead and just kill me. So isn't that interesting? Two completely different ways of reading this verse. When he says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, is he submitting to God or is he rebelling against God? And the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Okay? Because if you look at the rest of what he says, he is starting to come to his senses, but not because he's looking at God, I don't think, but because he's looking at them. Now, look at the whole verse. He doesn't say, pick me up and throw me into the sea because I deserve it or because I'm trying to get away. What does he say? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you. Now, and it may only be pity at this point, but this is significant to me. He's finally starting to come to his senses spiritually because he's thinking about somebody besides himself. That's always step one. He's looking at them in love, and he's realizing, okay, your lives are in jeopardy because of me. This is not right. You should not be dying for me. I should be dying for you. It's my fault your lives are in jeopardy. This is not fair. I'm sorry. I don't want you to die for me. I'll die for you. Throw me in. It's like sometimes with an alcoholic, the thing that wakes them up is to see what they're doing to their kids or to these others, and that's the thing. It may not be the full God moment, but at least wakes you up. Now, the reality is they don't want to do it at first, right? Remember, they're scared to death. They finally do it, and then what happened? Instantly, sea's calmed. Right? They know it's a miracle. Verse 15, and they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At what? This is the question. The men greatly feared. All right, now this doesn't make any sense. Notice, verse 4 and 5, you got a storm. Storm equals fear. Okay? Verse 10 and 11, bigger storm equals bigger fear. Verse 15, no storm. What would we expect? No fear. But that's not what it says. Right? Great fear. Wait a minute. What's going on? Say this, it's a different kind of fear once the sun comes out. In Psalm 130, verse 4, the psalmist says this, there is forgiveness with you, talking to God. You have forgiven me, therefore I fear you. Does that seem counterintuitive? Right? I mean, when we think of the fear of the Lord, we think of being scared of God, right? Maybe that Jaws theme plays a do-do-do-do-do-do, God's coming. Do-do-do-do-do-do, he's going to get you. We get scared. See, a minute ago, the sailors are crying out, don't kill us, don't kill us. But now something new has happened. And Psalm 130 says, you've forgiven my sins, you forgive me, and therefore I fear you. And so what that means is this, fear of God means awe and wonder and amazement, an existential grasping of the greatness of who God is. When they saw Jonah say, throw me in for you, what they saw was a willing sacrifice. See? And they were amazed that the wrath of God, which had been so furious, was so suddenly stilled. Right? That God had accepted the sacrifice of love. And as a result, they were beginning to experience the real fear of God, which is not cowering and being frightened, but being filled with awe and wonder. So it's a fear that casts out all other fear because it's an amazement at his love, which is seen through substitutionary sacrifice. Now, let me ask you something. If these pagan sailors, if they could get this, if they could handle their fear that way, how many more resources do you and I have? Right? I mean, these guys never read the Gospel of Matthew. You know why? Nobody had written it yet. Hundreds of more years before that's going to be written. They'd never written the part where the religious leaders come to Jesus and say, hey, do us a miracle to prove who you really are. And Jesus says, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And now something greater than Jonah is here. So what's Jesus saying? He's saying there is only really one storm that can take you out. There's only really one storm that can sink you. And that is if at the end of your life, when you look at all the things you've done, how are you going to stand before God? Knowing deep down that in spite of all your bluster, in spite of all your attempts, we're all guilty. That we don't measure up. That we've had a bigger hand in making the world a worse place than making the world a better place. Jesus says, I took the ultimate storm. I am the ultimate Jonah. I went beneath not just the waves of the water. I went beneath the waves of the ultimate punishment and justice. I went under the only storm that could ever take you out. And as a result of that, you will have calm. See, if Jesus Christ, if the true Jonah has taken out the only storm that can really clobber me, then and only then am I safe. Because 1 John 4:18 says, perfect love drives out fear. If I know that I'm loved because of what he's done for me, then and only then can I get rid of my fear. Okay. Can I tell you? I can't get rid of my fear by building taller walls. Right? Drones and bunker busting missiles, they don't care about your walls. I can't control my fear by getting better health insurance policies. Diseases don't really care about your health insurance. I can't control the fear by amassing a bigger retirement portfolio. Recessions don't care about your pension fund. I can't get rid of fear in any of these ways. I have to know that the one who made the universe and the one who is all-powerful, that he loves me. And the only way I know that is if Jesus is the ultimate Jonah, the willing sacrifice who said, it's not just enough to say I love you, I'm going to prove it. I'll die for you. Let me finish it like this. I am aware that for certain folks, it would be very easy to respond to a message like this by saying, okay, I've got it. In fact, I come to Southwest Family regularly, and Anthony's a little repetitious, so I've heard all this before. I know the drill. You have to, first of all, stop living for material things. Check, got that. Then you have to live for God, but not in a religious kind of works righteousness way. No. You have to fall on grace and understand what the gospel is. Check. Got it. That's how I fight fear. Well, yeah. But here's the thing. Be careful. And here's why. I wrote this sermon, okay? And I have had a terrible week with fear. I knew I was going to be preaching to you guys on the topic of how to overcome fear. It's fairly clear from the text. I knew in advance, like just looking at this one, okay, that one's going to be about fear. But here's what I found. You can know it all. Right? I'm kind of the ultimate know-it-all, right? Oh. You can know all the right things. It's one thing to know it. It's another thing to inhabit it. And so I've gone through this week. I had an event on Tuesday this week, a experience that I had been looking forward to. It was a task I had been given, and I had been preparing for it for months and really working. And I created this document that I was to present, and I really felt good about it. I felt like God was guiding. I even told Deanna, this could open some doors. This is good stuff. And so then Tuesday, I get to the meeting and I present it, and it went south hard. I mean, it was painful, and to make I did not see it coming. You ever know? You know when you're handing in junk. You're like you turn in a last minute thing, and the professor goes, "That's garbage," and you go, "That's fair." But if you put the time in, you go, "This is going to be." They're going to like put this on the board, and they go, "That was garbage." You're like, "Whoa, hold on." And everybody else goes, yeah, it's garbage. And so to make matters worse, I left here at 6:30 a.m. to drive to Dallas and sit through a 5-hour massacre and then turn around and drive back down I-35. So it was pretty miserable, just a nasty day. But, you have those days you go on. But what I found was it left me in doubt about a core part of my being. All these negative scenarios are in my head, imaginary arguments. I was loading the dishwasher the other day, and Deanna said something, and I kind of snapped her, and I go, you know what? That wasn't to you. I'm having an argument in my head with this other guy, and you just kind of got in the way of it. And so I've spent the last several days doubting myself, doubting my giftings, doubting my calling. I got a theological book in the mail the other day, and I opened it, I was like, what's even the point? Now, if you know me, that's rock bottom, all right? That's not good. But it threw me, and I didn't see it coming. It was a storm, and what it did was expose some rats in my cellar. Okay? Now, I know the gospel. I preach the gospel. I'm not a hypocrite. I drink the same water that I'm pouring for you. Okay? But I was amazed, really to a humiliating degree, to what extent I was getting my own self-worth and my own security, listen to this, out of my ability to fathom and impart, ironically enough, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some of you will not be able to understand what I'm about to say. This is Christian graduate school, but it is possible to make an idol out of how well I know the gospel, rather than make my life all about the gospel itself. I'm not even sure I understand that. But it's not hard to become a Jonah. You know how Jesus says, there's a place where Jesus gives the parable, build your house upon the rock, not upon the sand. Because if you build it on the sand, the storm comes, it's going to wash away. Right? And I amen that. And the reality is, I'm a realist. So I think, I think my house is mostly built on the rock, and there's a little bit on the sand. Let's just be honest. And you know what? Then whenever a storm comes, it comes into my life, and I go, oh my word, are you kidding me? And I realize there's actually a whole lot more of it is built on the sand, and a little bit of it's over on the rock. So what are we supposed to do about that? I'll tell you what I have to do. I just have to do this. This is not the first time in my life this has happened. It won't be the last time. But it's kind of like this. Okay, it's New Year's. Is anybody doing the physical fitness thing for New Year? Anybody, you're working out, you're joining a gym, you kind of do that. So I am actually in the longest continual fitness activity of my life. Deanna is too. Right before the end of the year, I logged my 100th check-in at Camp Gladiator. They literally gave me a cookie. But that, got a t-shirt. But that represents 100 hours of self-initiated physical torture. And so just this last Thursday morning, I was out the door here. I was on the parking lot at 5 a.m. in the morning, running laps around the parking lot, lifting weights, doing all this. Now, when I was done with that workout, when I was done lifting those weights and doing the, did I feel stronger? No. No. I felt like the weakest human being on the planet. I hurt. I went home and went back to bed. I couldn't walk for the next 2 days. I'm finally starting to feel better. Why? So I can go out tomorrow and do the whole thing again, right? But here's the thing. You know what I know. Even if I don't feel like it most days, what's happening out there? Day after day, week after week, check-in after check-in. What? I am getting stronger, aren't I? I am. I'm lifting heavier weights than when I started. I've got more stamina. I'm able to breathe more when I run than I used to. I can do more things. Those of you who work out, you understand this. As you're getting stronger physically, see, you feel like you're getting weaker. But if you just stick with it over and over, when it's all done, you actually are stronger, right? And so what is the reward? does my fitness instructor go, hey, great job. Why don't you back off those weights a little bit? No. Crazy woman's trying to get me to use heavier weights. I'm like, these are killing me. What are you doing, right? But this is how it works. Listen, right now, if you read the scriptures, if you pray day and night, if you talk to Jesus until his love kind of gets real to you, if you commit to a group of Christians to do life with you and kind of hold you accountable, if you come here Sunday after Sunday and let me pester you and get all up in your business, and even more, if you get into your heart and you talk to your heart and you say, you know what, heart, you thought you trusted in God, but you don't really. But we're not going to beat ourselves up. We're just going to start now. We're just going to start again. If you do all those things, as many of you are doing, and you do them in the sun, and you do them in the storm, you don't feel like you're getting any stronger, but you are. I see it in you, even if you don't see it in yourself. But God sees it most of all. What are you doing? You're moving your house a little bit more over on the rocks and a little bit less on the sand. And so you can't just know it. You have to inhabit it. And that's why I wanted to end today by receiving a communion with my spiritual family. Because I don't know what your week was like, but I need a tangible reminder of what has been done for me. I need a tangible reminder of where my security rests. I need to hold it in my hand, and I need to taste it on my tongue. And so this bread represents Jesus' body broken for us. And this cup represents his blood poured out for us. And that's what makes him the true Jonah. He went into the storm. He went under the waves so that we could have the calm. And this is how we face our fears. Over and over and over again. The band's going to come, but as they do, I want to pray for you. Let's pray. Father God, what this Lord's Supper, this Eucharist, this communion, what it's all about is trying to take things that we know in our heads, but we need to make them real. This bread, this cup, this physical stuff, this material stuff is here to take these things that sometimes are not terribly real to us and make them real to us. And so, Father, that's what we have to do right now. We thank you for giving us in the story of the cross the ultimate answer to fear. There is a perfect love that casts out fear. But of course, Father, we imperfectly hold on to that perfect love, and so we still have our fears. And I don't know what everybody's fears are in this room. I know they're different. Some people are desperately afraid. People in their field are going to find out they don't belong. They got that imposter syndrome, and maybe for some good reason. Maybe they're afraid of what's going on in their relationship. Maybe they're afraid of what the doctor said. Or maybe they're just afraid to go to the doctor because they're afraid of what he might say. I don't know what they are. But Father, help us to be able to let go of some of our fears. Help us to be better because we spend time at this table together as a body, knowing together, confessing with one another that perfect love casts out fear. And we pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is perfect love, who demonstrated perfect love for us on the cross where his body was broken and his blood was poured out. We thank you in his name, he who Father dwells with you and with the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.